Did you know that the richest man in modern history wasn't an oil sheik, wasn't a tech magnate, and definitely wasn't someone who believed in charity for the goodness of his heart? John D. Rockefeller died 88 years ago, but the structures he created to control not just money but consciences are still here, shaping every penny you spend and every belief you swallow without questioning. And the question nobody wants to ask is, when does philanthropy become just another investment with guaranteed returns in social obedience? Welcome to the dark side of the man who turned charity into a domination strategy and made religious institutions dance to his tune. Rockefeller didn't die. He just outsourced his control to systems you call benevolence. Let's start with the basics nobody tells you in school. John D. Rockefeller wasn't just rich, he was obscenely, absurdly, criminally rich. We're talking about a man who, in adjusted values, accumulated a fortune estimated at over $400 billion. To put this in perspective, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk combined don't even come close. But here's the juicy detail that history classes love to omit. Rockefeller built this empire through practices that today would be considered cartel, market manipulation, and systematic destruction of competition. He bought entire railroads just to control the transportation price of competitors' oil. He paid spies to infiltrate rival companies. He used intimidation tactics that would make any modern mafia blush with shame. And when the government finally had the courage to prosecute him for monopoly in 1911, you know what happened. They split Standard Oil into 34 smaller companies. And Rockefeller? He got even richer because he had shares in all of them. The system didn't punish him. The system rewarded him for playing the rules so well they broke. But here's where the story gets really interesting, and where the connection with religious institutions you never suspected comes in. Rockefeller wasn't a philanthropist out of kindness. He was a brilliant strategist who understood something that would take decades for the rest of the world to comprehend. Reputation is the most valuable asset that exists. At the end of the 19th century, Rockefeller was the most hated man in America. Newspapers called him a thief. Caricatures portrayed him as a giant octopus strangling the economy. Workers spat at hearing his name, and that's when he had an epiphany. Or rather, that's when his public relations consultants had an epiphany. He needed to wash his image, and there was no better soap than religion and charity. Rockefeller started donating money. Lots of money, but it wasn't just any donation. It was strategic investment disguised as generosity. He donated to Baptist churches, to hospitals, to universities, creating the Rockefeller Foundation in 1913. One of the first major philanthropic foundations in the world. And suddenly, the corporate demon became the saint of the needy. The media changed its tone. Churches blessed him. Universities put his name on buildings. But here's the truth that hurts. Every dollar donated bought not just gratitude, but control over narratives, influence over public policies, and access to hearts and minds through the institutions people trusted most, especially religious ones. Let's dive deeper into this relationship between dirty money and clean faith. Rockefeller was a devout Baptist, attended church religiously, and it's not irony, he really went. He gave tithes since he was young, even when he was poor. But as his fortune grew, his tithes became something completely different. He wasn't just contributing to the church, he was shaping theology. Rockefeller donated millions to Baptist seminaries and religious education institutions, but with an unwritten condition. These institutions should promote a specific version of Christianity, one that was compatible with unbridled capitalism. A theology that preached prosperity, personal discipline, and conveniently, obedience to power structures. He financed the creation of the University of Chicago, which became a center of liberal theological thought that validated wealth as a sign of divine blessing. It's no coincidence that during this time, the so-called prosperity gospel began to gain strength in America. The idea that God wants you to be rich, that poverty is lack of faith, that accumulating wealth is not sin but divine purpose. Rockefeller was literally buying a theology that justified his own existence. And the churches? Well, they accepted the money with open arms because money has no smell, even when it comes from monopolies that crushed entire families. But Rockefeller's sinister genius didn't stop there. He understood something that few tycoons of his time comprehended. Religious institutions are machines of social legitimacy. They reach the masses in a way that no politician or businessman can. They speak directly to people's consciences. And when you control these institutions, you don't just control money, you control public morality itself. Rockefeller used his donations to create networks of influence that extended far beyond pulpits. He financed medical missions in China and Africa through Christian organizations, bringing not just medicine, but a specific vision of civilization that validated American economic imperialism. He supported temperance campaigns that, conveniently, helped create a more disciplined and productive workforce. Every philanthropic gesture had a calculated return, and religious institutions, often without realizing it, became instruments of social engineering that directly benefited Rockefeller's interests and the capitalist class he represented. Now, let's talk about something that will make you question everything you know about religious institutions and money. The Rockefeller Foundation wasn't just a charity organization. It was a laboratory of social control. Under the guise of eradicating diseases and promoting education, the Rockefeller Foundation financed eugenic research in the first half of the 20th century. Yes, you read that right. Eugenics, the pseudoscience that inspired Hitler and preached the improvement of the human race through selective breeding. And you know who publicly supported this research? Several Christian denominations of the time, who saw in eugenics a way to fulfill the divine mandate of managing creation. Rockefeller financed institutes that promoted forced sterilization of the poor, the mentally ill, and minorities. He supported laws that prevented interracial marriages. And all of this was wrapped in a language of scientific progress and moral responsibility. The churches that received his money rarely questioned. After all, he was saving lives through public health campaigns. He was building hospitals. He was educating people. How could you question such a generous benefactor? And so, morality and rotten science walked hand in hand, financed by monopoly money and blessed by institutions that should defend the weakest. Here's a question I want you to reflect on and answer in the comments. To what extent is billionaires' charity really generosity, or just another way to maintain control over social systems and perpetuate the inequality that enriched them in the first place? Think about it while we continue dissecting this 88-year-old corpse that still reeks of manipulation. Let's return to the central point. Rockefeller didn't invent the relationship between money and religion, but he perfected it for the modern era. For centuries, churches accumulated vast fortunes. The medieval Catholic Church was literally the richest institution in Europe, owning up to a third of all lands in some kingdoms. It charged mandatory tithes, sold indulgences, controlled education and justice. Kings bowed to the Pope not out of devotion, but out of economic and political necessity. The Vatican was a bank, a state, and a multinational corporation all at once. And you know what happened when Martin Luther questioned this structure? The Protestant Reformation wasn't just about theology, it was about money. It was about who controlled the riches of faith. And what Rockefeller did was bring this model to industrial capitalism. He created a new form of indulgence, corporate philanthropy. You can sin in the market, crush competitors, exploit workers, pollute the environment, as long as you donate enough afterwards to clean your public conscience. And religious institutions, Protestant or Catholic, were more than willing to offer absolution in exchange for generous checks. Let's look at concrete numbers to understand the scale of this operation. During his lifetime, Rockefeller donated about $550 million, the equivalent of more than $14 billion today. Sounds like a lot, doesn't it? But he died with a fortune estimated at $1.4 billion of the time, about $400 billion in current values. So he donated only a fraction of what he accumulated. But that fraction was enough to buy complete historical redemption. Today, when you hear the name Rockefeller, you think of universities, hospitals, museums. You don't think of the workers who died in accidents at his refineries. You don't think of the families destroyed when he bought competitors at forced liquidation prices. You don't think of the rivers poisoned by his chemicals. All of this was erased by the most efficient reputation washing machine ever created. Strategic philanthropy supported by religious institutions that gave the seal of moral approval. And this formula? It's alive today. Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg all follow the Rockefeller manual, accumulate wealth through questionable practices, then create a foundation, donate to popular causes, appear alongside religious leaders and NGOs, and there you go. You're no longer an exploitative billionaire. You're a savior of humanity. But let's talk about the even darker side, the direct corruption of religious institutions through Rockefeller money. 1920, the Rockefeller Foundation began financing the ecumenical movement, which sought to unite different Christian denominations. Sounds noble, right? Unity in faith. But the real objective was to create large, centralized religious organizations that were easier to influence and control. Small, independent churches were unpredictable. They could preach against capitalism. They could defend workers on strikes. But large bureaucratic denominations that depended on millionaire donations, those were much more malleable. The foundation donated millions to the Federal Council of Churches, precursor to the National Council of Churches, which became one of the most influential voices in American Christianity. And coincidentally, this council rarely criticized corporate practices, rarely defended radical economic reforms, and frequently preached a version of Christianity that was perfectly compatible with the capitalist status quo. Rockefeller didn't need to buy each pastor individually. He just bought the structures that controlled the pastors. It's systemic corruption in its most elegant form. And we can't forget the international role. Rockefeller didn't limit his influence to the United States. Through his foundations, he exported the American model of capitalist Christianity to the entire world. In China, before the Communist Revolution, missionaries financed by Rockefeller established hospitals and schools that also functioned as centers of American commercial influence. In Latin America, the Rockefeller Foundation financed health programs that, conveniently, opened markets for American pharmaceutical products. In Africa, campaigns against tropical diseases were accompanied by educational programs that taught Protestant values of hard work and savings, preparing populations to be disciplined labor for Western companies. Every philanthropic dollar had a geopolitical objective, and local churches, grateful for financial support, rarely questioned the agenda behind the generosity. Religious missions became extensions of economic imperialism, and Rockefeller was one of the architects of this system. He understood that controlling the faith of a people is controlling the future of that people. But here's what should really scare us. Rockefeller's legacy didn't end with his death in 1937. The structures he created continue operating. The Rockefeller Foundation still exists, still donates billions, still influences global public policies, and the model he established of billionaires using philanthropy to shape societies and buy moral legitimacy through religious and academic institutions is now the norm. We live in a world where the richest don't pay proportional taxes, but create foundations that give them control over how their resources are used, without the democratic oversight that elected governments face. And religious institutions? Many still depend on these donations, still celebrate these benefactors, still offer moral coverage for economic systems that generate exactly the inequality that charity pretends to solve. It's a perfect and perverse cycle. Capitalism generates inequality. Inequality generates need for charity. Charity generates social control. Social control perpetuates capitalism. And Rockefeller was the master who taught this macabre dance. Let's be clear about one thing. I'm not saying all philanthropy is bad, or that all religious institutions are corrupt. There are genuine donations. There are organizations that do real work of social transformation. But what Rockefeller taught us is that we must always ask, who is donating? Why are they donating? And what are the implicit or explicit conditions of this donation? When a billionaire creates a foundation, who controls the agenda of that foundation? When a church accepts millions from a tycoon, to what extent does it maintain its moral independence? These are questions that society stopped asking because we were trained to see philanthropy as always positive, always benevolent. But Rockefeller showed us the truth. Philanthropy can be the most sophisticated form of maintaining power and inequality. In religious institutions, which should be guardians of justice, frequently become accomplices when the price is high enough. Think about the religious scandals you know. Televangelists with private jets, mega churches that are basically corporations, pastors who preach prosperity while asking for money from poor retirees. All of this has roots in the model that Rockefeller helped normalize, the idea that wealth and faith not only coexist, but that wealth is evidence of divine blessing. This theology is not an accident. It was cultivated, financed, and promoted for decades through seminaries, universities, and organizations that received money from tycoons who had a direct interest in validating their own wealth. Rockefeller may have died 88 years ago, but the system he built is stronger than ever. And the scariest thing is that we don't even notice. We think we're living in free democracies, but we're living in systems where the richest buy, not just politicians and media, but morality itself through control of institutions that should be above money. And here's the final irony. The point that closes the circle. Was Rockefeller genuinely religious? Probably yes. He believed in God, read the Bible, prayed, but his religiosity didn't prevent his cruelty in business. It didn't prevent him from destroying lives. It didn't prevent him from using faith as a tool of control. And this tells us something profound about human nature and about religious institutions. Faith and morality are not the same thing. You can be devout and be monstrous. You can build churches and destroy communities. And religious institutions, no matter how sacred they proclaim themselves, are made of people. And people are corruptible, especially when money is abundant and questions are few. Rockefeller understood this better than any theologian of his time. He knew he didn't need to convert hearts, he just needed to finance structures. And so he built an empire not just of oil, but of moral influence that persists decades after his death. So, what did we learn from John D. Rockefeller, the man who died 88 years ago, but still controls significant pieces of how we think about wealth, charity, and faith? We learned that money is not neutral. We learned that philanthropy is not always kindness. We learned that religious institutions, no matter how holy they seem, are vulnerable to corruption when money and power are involved. We learned that history is written by the victors, and the victors are those with enough resources to erase their sins and write their virtues in golden letters on the walls of universities and hospitals. And we learned that we need to be skeptical, questioning, critical of any narrative that paints billionaires as saviors and charity as the solution to structural problems that capitalism itself creates. Rockefeller didn't die. He just transformed into a system, and as long as we don't recognize this, as long as we don't question the literal and metaphorical foundations he built, we will continue dancing to the music he composed more than a century ago. The question is, are you ready to stop dancing and start questioning the melody?